Jacob Lest, and I'm here to introduce Benjamin Schmitt. Dr. Schmitt is currently a Center for European Policy Analysis non-resident senior fellow and a postdoctoral research fellow and project development scientist at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. From 2015 to 2019, he served as a European energy security advisor at the US State Department, where he advanced diplomatic engagement vital to the energy and national security interests of the transatlantic community, with a focus on supporting the resilience of NATO's eastern flank as it faced Russian malign energy activities. And with that, welcome, Ben, and we're looking forward to your talk. Oh, and I should mention one thing. Ben's been having some internet problems, so please bear with us if anything happens.
Yeah, if this cuts out, I will be back as soon as I can reconnect, so I won't be going far. But thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you, Irina, and thank you to Arizona State for having me here today in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. I'm actually in cold Boston, so would love to be out in the sun in the desert. But anyways, it's just great to be here and great to talk about these issues today. I think I'll just start by saying it's incredibly important for, in my view, coming from a place of policy and science from both kind of the sides of my working world, that it's incredibly important for students and practitioners of foreign policy, grand strategy, and contemporary trends of great power competition to keep in mind the critical role that effective policy planning with respect to energy security plays in this space when we're looking at, in particular, Russia's role in the European energy space, and the way that practical technology considerations can have a truly transformational role in this issue set. Because at the end of the day, I don't care if a nation or a company or a person is trying to develop a power plant, a wind farm, a solar array, nuclear fusion system, or gas pipeline. They're all large-scale infrastructure projects, and they share the same basic development path that we use in large-scale science and technology development, like that I'm working on with my team at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, which Jacob mentioned, where we're working to collaborate with researchers across the nation to develop next-generation telescope instrumentation and infrastructure at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station to probe the cosmic microwave background. I'm not going to be talking about astrophysics today, don't worry. We'll be talking about Russian energy issues, but I just want to say that to underscore that the sort of practical infrastructure considerations that energy security requires has really been a hallmark of Europe's own path to energy integration and ultimately political cohesion with its energy development over the past 70 plus years. It really should come as no surprise that the energy cooperation itself was actually the initial platform for which larger scale European political cohesion and ultimately the European Union itself was founded on. Let's think back to the days right after World War II, when the establishment of the European coal and steel community allowed for the first burgeoning political continuity on the continent. And that allowed for the establishment of the European Energy Union policy framework after the establishment of the European Union for infrastructure diversification strategies and market liberalization policies like the EU Third Energy Package that are really the cornerstone of Europe's energy security today. And that's why I always like to call infrastructure as kind of the necessary hardware that you need for energy security in Europe, and regulatory legislation, the vital software of Europe's energy security. And then this way, energy cooperation is really a unique area of foreign and security policy because you can really have fundamental developments in the underlying science and technology, or just hard engineering skills that have the ability to offer practical technical solutions to address and overcome some of the most pressing geopolitical challenges of our time. And at the same time that we're talking about this, this grand integration through energy in the European Union, for many years now, we've seen pushback on this. We've seen pushback from state-owned enterprises from authoritarian states, using both critical infrastructure and energy infrastructure developments for influence projection around the globe, whether it's through predatory loan guarantees and debt trap diplomacy on the part of Beijing through its Belt and Road strategy, or through its 16+1 initiative across Central and Eastern Europe, or through Russia's energy infrastructure proposals toward the European continent. So when we think about how the Russian Federation has used its energy resources in Europe and also globally over the last decade, there's really been two pillars of thought that have emerged that I really, heard a lot over the last decade coming into the start of this year. And those are, number one, that the Russian Federation uses oil reserves and oil resources to generate state revenues, and it uses gas for political leverage, malign influence, and elite capture. And the second was that at the beginning of 2020, we would have a large-scale gas crisis in Europe due to a Russian cutoff of the Ukrainian gas transmission system, or GTS, owing to the end of the previous long-term contract of gas transit through Ukraine during the past decade. With that said, the energy trends we've seen this year in 2020 from the Kremlin really might force us to ask ourselves if Mr. Putin has inverted these longstanding assumptions to a certain degree. Because I'm fairly certain, had I asked watchers of European energy security issues at various points over the past 5 years, what they would predict might be the biggest energy threat facing Europe in early 2020, they would have predicted this gas cutoff of Ukraine, and the fact that would be the defining moment. And that's because we would see this looming prospect of the completion of two main pieces of infrastructure used by Moscow to divert gas around Ukraine, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in the Baltic Sea and the Turk Stream pipeline in the Black Sea. And I definitely was among that crowd that thought that way. So let's just step back for a second. What are these pipelines? What's at stake? Taken together, Nord Stream 2 is a 55 billion cubic meter per year capacity pipeline to move natural gas from the Russian Federation to Germany through the Baltic Sea. And Turk Stream has two lines of 15.75 billion cubic meters per year that provide the Kremlin with the technical capabilities, if they're both completely completed, to make good on its long-standing and publicly acknowledged policy objective of ending or drastically reducing gas transit via Ukraine. So if Nord Stream 2 is completed and coupled with Turk Stream, the subsequent nearly total loss of gas shipments via the Ukrainian GTS would remove significant transit revenues from the already stressed Ukrainian economy. And this is something that's often said pretty readily in the discussion of what's at stake for Ukraine. When you talk about concerns over Gazprom's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. But for me, and for many national security watchers of this space, perhaps more worrying is the impact in Ukraine's national security itself. In the short term, the current gas transit between Naftogaz and Gazprom has actually been extended in an agreement that was completed at the end of 2019, and this gas crisis was averted at the beginning of this year. Which is an unlikely outcome had Nord Stream 2 been completed. But this, of course, didn't take place because there was increased regulatory oversight from the EU with the April 2019 update to the EU gas directive, as well as the successful limited technology calibrated sanctions action via the 2020 U.S. National Defense Authorization Act, which was passed on an overwhelming bipartisan basis in both the House and Senate. And it was signed into law in late December, such that in fairly dramatic real-time fashion, just minutes before that signing took place, the principal Nord Stream 2 pipeline vessel owned and operated by the Swiss firm Allseas suspended pipe deployment operations and rapidly exited the Baltic Sea in the following days. And that new agreement that actually came forth out of that allowed Gazprom to finally agree to pay $2.9 billion in damages to Naftogaz from the February 2018 Stockholm Arbitration Tribunal ruling for Gazprom's non-delivery of gas transit volumes under the two firms' 2009 long-term gas transit contract. So because of this transit extension, this major catastrophe was averted, so to speak. The Russian Federation thus still relies on the Ukrainian gas transmission system for delivery of its natural gas onward to European markets. But if Nord Stream 2 were completed, it's still tempting to be completed right now as we speak, and if it were coupled with Turk Stream, there'd be one less strategic deterrent against the extension of Russian aggression beyond Donbass, notable given the close proximity of still operational transmission pipeline infrastructure near the line of contact in eastern Ukraine that the Russian Federation still relies on to get gas to European markets for its own revenue production. So especially in this context, and in the context of this year's continued instances of military escalation by Russian forces against Ukrainian positions that we've seen throughout the year along the line of contact, this potential security knock-on effect of Nord Stream 2 is worrisome, to say the least. And for those of you that might want a preview of what would happen if Nord Stream 2 were completed, you don't have to just speculate that this is what the Kremlin wants to do, even though it has said this. Turk Stream, to a lesser extent, because it's smaller, has already demonstrated this strategy. Instead of providing new volumes to the Balkan region via the Black Sea, as Gazprom has claimed, over the first quarter of 2020, earlier this year, we saw that the second line of Turk Stream has resulted in a 70% drop, 70%, in gas volumes transiting the Ukrainian GTS from Russia via the traditional Trans-Balkan route that would go from Russia through Ukraine and then through the Eastern Balkan nations to Southeastern Europe, where we saw even, more specifically, the volume transited at the Olovka compressor and metering station on the Ukraine-Romania border dropped 90% compared to the same period in 2019. So make no mistake, cutting off Ukraine and cutting off these traditional routes is what Moscow is trying to do. And given, thankfully, Turk Stream's limited capacity, it hasn't had the technical capability yet to fully cut off Ukraine and destabilize Eastern European markets in this way. So we may want to think, what are these projects about? And I'll end my opener on this and kind of set up our discussion to come in this session. So what Gazprom claims and what project supporters in Western Europe claim is that this project is aimed at filling in a purported gas demand, quote unquote, gap due to purported production declines off the coast of Groningen in the Netherlands, since the design of these projects themselves actually betrays this narrative. So it goes against what these kind of top line talking points and commercial sales points say. In particular, the onshore extension of Nord Stream 2, EUGAL, is principally directed eastward through the Czech Republic en route to OMV's, which is the Austrian gas company, to OMV's gas distribution hub at Baumgarten, which is the de facto end of the current Ukrainian gas transit route from Russia to Europe. So under 20% of the project capacity is actually allocated for direct delivery westward. So if this idea that this is actually gas for Western Europe or for Germany, which is what project promoters are often claiming were true, you'd have more of that gas going there. Instead, only up to a technical maximum of about 20% or 9.9 BCMA is headed that way, where the remaining majority of this is going to the endpoint of the current Ukrainian gas transit route. So from a technical reality, this is about doing just that, cutting off Ukraine. What's in it for the Kremlin? That's a bigger question, and probably the one that we should talk a little bit more about today. For the transatlantic community more broadly, projects like Nord Stream 2 provide a vehicle for Russian strategic corruption and malign influence campaigns across the West. They're not, quote, just commercial deals, as we often hear from Gazprom and its allies. So what's in it for firms collaborating with Gazprom on the project? At the time of Nord Stream 2's announcement in 2015, several of the European then shareholders, just for reference, back when Nord Stream was announced, 5 Western European companies signed on as 10% shareholders, but because of a Polish antitrust case that took place in 2016, they actually got out. Now they're, I don't know what they call themselves, Western Investment Partners. They're somehow non-equity shareholders or something like that, which I think maybe in the works of being challenged based on recent headlines by the Poles right now. But that includes that collection of companies and countries include France's NG, Royal Dutch Shell in the Netherlands, 2 German firms, BASF Wintershall and Uniper, and then Austria's OMV. So what's in it for them? Why are they in this? If this is really just, replacement infrastructure, it's not actually bringing new resources to a great extent to Europe. Well, at the time of the Nord Stream 2 announcement in 2015, several of the European then shareholders like OMV and BASF Wintershall signed lucrative asset swap agreements with Gazprom for gas production rights upstream in the Russian Federation, mostly in Western Siberia, which had been put on hold only too briefly following Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and aggression in eastern Ukraine. For Moscow itself, we looked to a hard-hitting 2018 Sberbank analysis that revealed that Gazprom's investments in projects like Nord Stream 2 and Turkstream are in fact significantly value destructive for its shareholders, analyzing it would take Nord Stream 2 at least 20 years to become profitable, while Turkstream would take a whopping 47 years to break even. So these are really not projects that companies get into for their shareholders if they're going to have to wait a half century. So while the Sberbank report at the time projected that that Russia's Far East pipeline, there's another pipeline being built across the continent, its Power of Siberia pipeline to China would take 16 years to become profitable. Even that rosy estimate this year was put into question given a Russian investigative report that came out in the early summer of this year that showed a wide array of evidence of endemic oligarchic corruption, safety issues, and perhaps most important of all, cover-ups by Gazprom leadership that have jeopardized the potential that the Siberian fields that are supposed to be feeding that pipeline to bring gas to China would even be able to supply the pipeline at full capacity due to improper drilling procedures, all in a supposed race by Moscow to beat U.S. shale gas to the Chinese market. It's actually funny, one Russian observer of those procedures described the operation saying that here you have a Lamborghini, but you drive it along the road where the tractor should go. So that's kind of the operation that's being done in the East. And it's very similar to what we see with projects like Nord Stream 2 and Turkstream. So the fact of the matter is, when we look at these, we also look at what's in it for for the broader Western partners that are promoting this. And that's where, to me, the often overlooked and greatest energy threat that Russia poses to the West is actually not market-based, as is often analyzed in a kind of Bloomberg terminal format by some analysts on this issue. But it's an export of strategic corruption through energy infrastructure development. In particular, when we see companies that are Russian state-owned enterprises like Gazprom, Rosneft, and Rosatom, we see that they regularly use the development of large-scale energy infrastructure projects like pipelines, hydrocarbon upstream, civil nuclear installations, you name it, to exacerbate trends that we are really concerned about these days in the European and transatlantic security community, including elite capture trends in Western capitals. Once captured by the offer of lucrative lobbying or corporate positions associated with the Russian state, Western current and former senior officials regularly take policy positions that either A, fail to respond to active national security threats posed by the Russian Federation, or they just take positions that are overtly pro-Kremlin, often both. The result is the continual inability that we see in a lot of these discussions today to come to a transatlantic consensus on the appropriate countermeasures that need to be taken to deter further Kremlin hybrid warfare activities, divergent national strategies to address Russian threats, arguments over sanctions, and the associated degradation of national security norms and assumptions, all to the benefit of Moscow. So instead of normal commerciality, Vladimir Putin often uses these as a means of enriching contractors with close ties to the Russian president himself. And in this case, that includes companies controlled by Russian oligarchs already targeted under the U.S. sanctions program, such as Gennady Timchenko and Arkady Rotenberg. But Moscow's use of geopolitical projects like Nord Stream 2 don't need necessarily to be limited to domestic allies of Mr. Putin, and we've seen this a lot being part of the discussion in recent months. Notoriously, former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder advocated for the first Nord Stream pipeline while in office, and he was appointed chairman of Nord Stream AG shortly after leaving. And since then, he's become one of Putin's most effective Trojan horses in Europe, pushing back against Western sanctions, pushing for Crimea to be recognized as a part of Russia, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't stop at Schroeder. Over the past few years, with the advancement of Nord Stream 2, the list of Schroederized officials continues to get longer. Former Austrian Chancellor Christian Kern penned a strong letter co-authored by then German Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel decrying U.S. bipartisan 2017 Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act sanctions targeting Nord Stream 2. But of course, after he stepped out of office, he was appointed to the board of Kremlin-controlled Russian railways. Former Austrian Foreign Minister Karen Kneißl, who I'm sure some on this call will remember Mr. Putin danced with at her wedding just over a year ago, has also advanced several Nord Stream 2 endorsement pieces and interviews for Russian propaganda outlet RT, and Austrian former econ minister Hans-Georg Schelling, after pushing for Nord Stream 2 while in office, is now a senior advisor for Nord Stream 2. So I'll kind of end this opener on just to bring this home on this point. I've said this before. Jacob's probably heard me say it, but I'll say it here just to set the scene. Imagine if George W. Bush or Barack Obama were currently working on behalf of China's Huawei. Take a moment and imagine that. This wouldn't just be a major political story in Washington. It would be the only story. In fact, if anyone saw President Obama's stump speech yesterday for Vice President Biden's campaign, he actually kind of alluded to this sort of scenario, saying that he would be called Beijing Barry. So this is the sort of thing that obviously would be covered. But when we look to the Western European nations where we see these issues arising, it seems like a lot of the electorate has accepted this Schroederized status quo, and therefore there's little political motivation for former senior officials to resist becoming well-compensated conduits of Russian malign influence. And the case in point of this is that this summer there was a relative lack of outrage that the main witness called by the German Bundestag itself to criticize U.S. bipartisan sanctions actions aimed at stopping the Kremlin's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The main witness was Schroeder himself, even though at the event he was simply introduced as, at the hearing as the former chancellor rather than being recognized as what he is currently, a well-compensated Nord Stream 2 lobbyist. And this came to a head last month with this discussion. This is, I think, the real impetus why we're having this discussion today, why it was back in the headlines, is that after the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Navalny, there was a big push both in Europe and the United States to again consider really pushing back and sanctioning Nord Stream 2 as part of countermeasures to the Kremlin to really say, there's no business as usual going to go on. But all of these same Trojan horses, and it's an array of officials, but Schroeder in particular pushed back on this notion. And so Navalny himself got in a public media feud with Schroeder, where he said this. He said, quote, "Gerhard Schroeder is paid by Putin. If he tries now to deny the poison attack on me, it's very disappointing. It's one thing to be Putin's lobbyist, but now he is trying to protect murderers. It is humiliating to hear such words from the former chancellor. He's still the former chancellor of the most powerful country in Europe," Navalny said. "Now he's Putin's errand boy and he protects murderers. I don't know what covert payments Putin gave him. There's an official payment, and I have no doubt that there are covert payments as well. This is my personal opinion as a lawyer," says Navalny, who has studied Rosneft and Gazprom for years. Schroeder had a very, one could say, Trumpian response, which was to immediately run to the libel laws and try to sue Bild magazine for publishing the quote from Navalny. But that's kind of where things stand. And not to mention, I'll just add before we open for discussion, the lack of concern that the CEO of the pipeline itself is none other than Putin confidant and ex-Stasi officer who Putin allegedly worked with in Dresden back in the 80s, Matthias Vanig. So all of these threads have a long history in terms of how they've developed in terms of malign influence operations that started way back and are really endemic now, well into the second decade of the Putin regime. So with that, thank you for listening to my opener, and really look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben, for giving us that overview and really getting us into the details of what's going on with Nord Stream 2. If people have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure to read those to Ben. For now, I'll open with a few questions to get this started. What is the American position, the American government position, I should say, on this right now, and how has that shifted since the time you were working at the State Department through all the different entanglements with Russia and Ukraine the U.S. government's had in recent years, and where are we right now?
It's a great question. I mean, this was, just for context, this pipeline was first alluded to in 2014. The illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's aggression in Donbass basically put on ice this project, but not for too long, really just for about, between 9 and 12 months. After that, it started to percolate back up in mid-2015. And 2 weeks after I started at the State Department in my job on European energy security, the project was announced. And from that moment on, the United States was opposed to this for a myriad of reasons that I've mentioned this: strategic corruption, energy security, the fact that it runs counter to Europe's own energy diversification plans, and the outrage that this sparked in not just one or two countries, but a broad majority of transatlantic nations. The United States, Canada have stood out and spoken out against the project, as has the United Kingdom, Denmark, Sweden, to some extent France, and basically all of NATO's eastern flank. The three Baltic nations, the Visegrad Group, Romania has spoken out against it. So it's a really broad majority that have opposed this over the years. The Obama administration was strongly opposed, and being the point person for Ukraine, Joe Biden had made several statements against the pipeline, including his statement in August of 2016, calling it a fundamentally bad deal for Europe. The Trump administration, in maybe a show of one of the only issues, if not the only issue, that had almost identical policy continuity between the two administrations, continued that for the same reasons. Basically, concern over the national security impacts of this project and what they would have on Europe. And at the same time, this was broadly bipartisan on Capitol Hill. One of the first major voices on Capitol Hill to speak out against this was the late Senator McCain on the Republican side. But the sanctions bills that have been passed and proposed over the past few years have been bipartisan, led by Democrat Jeanne Shaheen and Republican Ted Cruz. So we've really seen this continuity. And I was asked recently to write a report on what Ukraine might be expecting in terms of a broad array of national security policies from the U.S., depending on who's in the White House after the election. And oh, by the way, the debate has started 3 minutes ago, so I'm glad everyone is stay tuned here. But regardless of that, I think it's going to stay the same. I think it's going to be very continuous. I don't see the Trump administration certainly changing their position should they continue. And the Biden administration, I would have predicted, would keep the same policy. But now I don't have to predict, because they put out multiple policy statements on various European nations, including Poland, Ukraine, the Baltics, multiple of which stated very clearly that a potential Biden administration would, from the outset, continue to oppose the completion of Nord Stream 2.
Now, you mentioned these Schroederized officials in Europe. Have we seen that happen in the United States or across the Atlantic yet? Or has that just been limited to Europe for right now?
I mean, I think these trends have really been seen on both sides of the Atlantic. There's a heck of a lot of lobbying going on both sides of the Atlantic, in particular in Washington, against the sanctions. You can look at all the publicly available lobbying records that are readily available online in Washington, and FAR registrations and things like this. And then, of course, that's going on across a number of European nations. I've seen reports from lobby control in Germany and Brussels, et cetera. So the The big names, though, are indeed in Europe and in just a couple of Western European nations, and that's why it's so concerning, because unfortunately, their electorate still is kind of just waking up to this manifestation of elite capture as a national security threat. And I think that if we really want to take this seriously as a transatlantic community and as transatlantic security experts, we need to come together in the future, over the next several years, with European and U.S. diplomats, and come to a transatlantic consensus, something like a transatlantic norm for a Foreign Agents Registration Act for folks that decide to exit government service and then go into working for a state-owned enterprise in some way or another, of either Moscow or Beijing, for that matter. So that's something that really needs to be considered, because that's a way that you can kind of legitimize what is often done in the shadows in some countries through dark money and that sort of thing. So that's a main concern. And I think those are the trends we need to watch going forward if we're going to be serious about this.
Great. So we have a couple of questions from people in the audience. And if you want to send a question, you can send it directly to me in the chat. I know there's no option to send to everyone. So our colleague Hilda Hogenboom says, what are Merkel's options with this situation?
Well, I'll tell you, the German government had a fairly golden opportunity to take an off-ramp on this over the past 6 weeks or so. And unfortunately, it seems that window is starting to close. I'm still hopeful that they will come to a consensus and stop the project. A wide array of officials from basically almost all of the parties, all the traditional parties in Germany, the CDU, the SPD, and the Greens in particular, as well as the FDP, all came out and called for either a pause to the pipeline due to the Navalny poisoning or an explicit stop to the project overall. And that includes green leaderships, that includes Christian Lindner of the FDP, that includes a number of the potential successors of Merkel, because there will be an election in Germany next year as Merkel comes to the end of her tenure. So I continue to be hopeful on that front, but ultimately it doesn't look like anything's happening soon. There are certainly legal and regulatory mechanisms by which the pipeline can be stopped by the German government. So this idea that it's too big to fail or too late in the process to be stopped is not true. Article 11 of the updated gas directive of the European Union Third Energy Package is one such roadblock that could be used as a regulatory measure, where Germany's state regulator, at the end of the day, before Nord Stream 2 comes into operation, needs to take action to assess whether this project has a negative energy security impact on either itself, on bordering member states of the EU, or of the Union as a whole. And certainly, it's been shown that these sort of projects have an impact. So that's an option. But unfortunately, I think what will ultimately happen is the sanctions that are currently on the books in the U.S., plus those that are forthcoming, still technology calibrated, aimed at not sectoral sanction, where the U.S. is trying to just sanction big G Gazprom to stop all Russian gas into Europe, but in particular taking kind of a, to the extent possible, surgical approach, at least thus far, where the existing sanctions only target vessels and those provisioning vessels that would be deploying Nord Stream 2 in terms of physical pipeline construction in the Baltic Sea. That's been successful thus far, but the Russians are still trying to push ahead with their own vessels, with firms that they may not care about being designated, just like a lot of some officials in the Russian Federation seem to kind of flout U.S. sanctions regimes elsewhere. But there is an additional bill in this year's NDAA, also by Shaheen and Cruz, that would slightly expand these sanctions to include things like post-construction certification, which Russia needs Western firms to actually go out and certify that the pipeline is safe and has come into operation properly. So that's important as well. I think that's going to spell the end of the project. It would be certainly much better to come to a transatlantic consensus on this. I wrote an open letter about 4 weeks ago that was published in Newsweek that was co-signed by 115 national security experts, former and current politicians and leaders from the transatlantic space that have all come out in resounding opposition to Nord Stream 2, including experts in Germany. And it had 3 provisions that we were pushing for and continue to push for, including transatlantic unified sanctions aimed at stopping Nord Stream 2, that also we would want to look at the potential to reduce oil imports in the West from Russian state-owned enterprises. There's been some level of talking points coming out of project supporters, in particular in Berlin, that have said, well, if you want us to, you being other countries want us to stop Nord Stream 2, you're still taking some small percentage of oil imports from Russian state-owned enterprises. You should think about that. And we said, that's a great point. It's not really a counter argument. It's a great point. So we put that in there. And we also basically set out this idea that we should try to close off routes for former Western officials to become employees in one way or the other, directly or indirectly, for Russian state-owned enterprises. Because again, that will begin to start that discussion on having a consensus to push back on strategic corruption that we see today.
Great. So a question from Emerald Peist. What are some of the tactics groups like Gazprom use to make the political goals of their energy expansion more acceptable to the public? Specifically, how has Nord Stream 2 been presented as a public good as opposed to a political liability?
It's a great question. There's a lot of savvy PR done. There's a lot of, if you look at their website, they have a lot of, nice infographics and things like this. They're pushing numbers that, as I said, maybe they're narratives that run parallel to what is actually going on. So again, the objective of the pipeline is to cut off Ukraine. The secondary and tertiary goals are to spread malign influence and enhance elite capture potential and things like that. At the same time, the sort of rhetoric that we're hearing a lot, maybe the biggest talking point that has been used to try to sell this in Western Europe, is the idea that the United States, in particular the Trump administration, is really just trying to sell its LNG resources, its dirty shale gas, quote unquote, to European markets, and that's why it wants to stop Nord Stream 2, quote unquote, because if it stops Nord Stream 2, then it can capture the market. Again, that doesn't hold up under technical scrutiny, because this project Nord Stream 2 is not aimed to bring significant new volumes to Western Europe. So if only 9.9 BCMA is actually going to be even technically possible to bring new gas to Western Europe, and all the rest is really just replacing existing flows, the nominal position is that flows will just continue via the Ukrainian gas transmission system, and that there won't be a net market to be captured or a net market to be gained by the US or any other LNG exporter. And I've said this a lot in response to those sort of accusations and in arguments that are put out relentlessly by Russian disinformation platforms, as well as in quotes in Western press, that the truth of the matter is, it really is national security that is driving U.S. opposition to this project, because we know that, I know that if Nord Stream 2 is stopped, it's not going to open a market. So I've often said, if that was our plan, and I was sitting in the State Department saying, hey guys, let's stop Nord Stream 2 in order to sell more LNG, I should be fired, because it is not not based in any sort of market or technical reality or geopolitical reality for that matter. And that's also in terms of a market consideration. Where is most of U.S. LNG gone since it started to be exported for the first time a few years ago? South America, and to a great extent, East Asia and China. And the reason for that is that that's where the market is sending it. That's where private sector actors are selling these resources. And it's, again, and I'm sure that you see this in other areas in all of your work covering Russia, but there is a proclivity in Moscow to project, project policies that are really kind of endemic to their regime on other nations. And so this idea that, there's no way that the U.S. is not trying to control and do this doesn't make sense, because in that context, you have state-owned enterprises like Gazprom that do have their shots called from the Kremlin. We, by contrast, don't have a hotline at the State Department where I pick up a phone and I say, "Hey, Chenier, send 2 LNG cargoes here and send 2 there in Europe, and wouldn't it be great?" This just doesn't happen because we don't have something in this country called Americaprom. It doesn't exist. We have a private sector that does its own thing, and I think that's a good thing.
This question's from Kelly Gallagher. She's asking you to just elaborate on how Russia has used energy infrastructure to export corruption in the past, and how they might use Nord Stream 2 or Turk Stream for the same purpose.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'd like to do is answer that by adding a little context to one of the things I pointed out, that the CEO of the pipeline is none other than Putin confidant and ex-Stasi officer Matthias Warnig. I don't know if you in your program have discussed Catherine Belton's book, Putin's People, yet. I don't know, Jacob, has this come up, or have folks read it? Okay, first of all, I'd highly recommend that you all read it right away. It's a book that I think will potentially go down as a seminal work on Russian influence in the West as it pertains to the historic arc from the mid 80s of Putin and the KGB all the way to today. And the biggest takeaway that I had from that book is how Catherine was able to draw this line, starting with the work that Putin and the KGB were undergoing to prepare for the downfall of the Soviet Union, all the way to the trends associated with projects like Nord Stream 2 today. Because according to Belton's research, Putin was very likely part of what was known at the time as Operation Luch, which was an operation that would be able to set up a front network of Russian influence among willing individuals and businesses across the West. The idea is that, at the time, the Soviet Union, the KGB, basically kind of saw that, the Soviet Union may dissolve soon. We need to figure out a way to plan for the future contingency. So, of course, as this was going on, Belton reports that, quote, one of the Stasi operatives Putin worked closely with was a short, round-faced German by the name of Matthias Warnig, who would later become a part of the Putin regime. And this includes, of course, a number of roles, starting with heading up Dresdner Bank. That was one of a number of what Belton described as KGB-linked foreign bankers that operated. He was operating in St. Petersburg in the early 90s. That eventual Gazprom contractor and Putin crony Timchenko, who, by the way, is involved in Nord Stream upstream development. And then, of course, at the end of the day, Warnig becoming the CEO of Nord Stream. So, again, to me, as an increasing number of transatlantic security issues have at their core this debate over Western cooperation with Russia, China, or other authoritarian states, it's as urgent as ever that the transatlantic community not shield these projects because of perceived short-term economic interests, but instead try to harmonize our approach so that, this idea that, we're just going to trade with these regimes because there are some areas and some, realpolitik ideals across certain sectors of the transatlantic community that says that change can be achieved through trade. I think what we've seen is that, that instead of democratic norms and liberal values trickling from the West through the increase of these cooperations with either major energy or infrastructure development or other deals with Russia and China. In fact, especially with Russia, the flow has been increasingly to export weaponized corruption and bad behavior downstream to us, where we where we are. So it's a difficult problem, and it's something that unfortunately has and I think will continue to cause strife in the transatlantic community among diplomats and officials. And it's something we really need to grapple with because it's not going to end anytime soon if it goes on like this.
So we have a question from Charlie Tiki. Are there any European or specifically German movements to develop other energy resources to give these nations leverage against Russia's strong gas influence? And if anyone has any other questions, please write them in.
Yeah, I mean, Germany has its Energiewende that it's been working on for for almost a decade. A better part of the past decade. I think it started in 2013. Don't quote me on that. But so there are, and at a broader level, there are plans at the EU level for an EU Green Deal. The sort of investment that will get us beyond hydrocarbon investments. And on that front, I always think it's funny that one of the first trips I took as a State Department official over to Germany itself to engage on this issue included a completely irrelevant stop that I wanted to put on my agenda at the Wendelstein 7X Stellarator fusion facility, physics research facility at the Max Planck Institute for Plasma Physics in Garching, Germany. And that was before I had even started any of my first meetings on that first trip on Nord Stream 2. So it didn't really dawn on me until after that visit, looking at this system, which among laser fusion and tokamak magnetic confinement fusion could be another option for really horizontal energy technology development down the road. As I walked out, I saw kind of an industrial site kind of in the distance, and I asked, what's that? And they said, oh, that's where the gas comes on shore from ostensibly from Nord Stream 2, near the Lubmin gas hub where Nord Stream actually comes on shore. And I laughed. Think about that. This project is being funded to the tune of, its nameplate sticker price is somewhere around $10 billion, but it's far higher than that, certainly, when you factor in all of the upstream development and all of the cost overruns and all of these sort of things. Imagine if we had, let's just take the sticker price at face value. Imagine if we had 10 billion directed to any one of these projects. I worked during my undergraduate at a laser fusion facility at the University of Rochester, where I grew up, and it was funny because at the time they would often say, that was in the early 2000s, that they had received almost $1 billion, something like $999 million in funding or something close to that, and indicating that they hadn't, even for a 30-year project, hadn't yet broken the billion mark, at least at that time. I think they've since gone over that, certainly. But imagine that, that's something that can actually bring a clean energy future, potentially, if we're lucky and if physics can be borne out on that, physics and engineering and creative solutions. If we get there, that's not even $1 billion was funded on that facility. That could really get us there. Imagine if we put 10 billion down, right? This is why fundamental science and technology investment really, really needs to be put at the forefront of a lot of these climate solutions for decades down the road.
There's a question from Keith Brown. He says, thanks for this rich teasing out of the personal clientelistic networks and Russia's security agenda. To critics and especially trolls, how do we articulate what distinguishes this kind of analysis, pulling together disparate threads and sources, and the current rash of conspiracy theories that find patterns or agendas in disparate data?
I mean, I guess you're referring to the strategic corruption elements. The fact that these guys, none of this is, you know, none of this is covert. All of these guys are working for the Russians, straight up. You know, Schroeder is working for Nord Stream, you know, for working for Gazprom. He's on the board of Rosneft. These aren't secrets. You know, this isn't kind of hiding in the shadows. Oh my God, we just figured out that Schroeder is getting money from Kremlin state-owned enterprises. This is what's happening. You know, he'll freely admit it. And again, it's this stigma that just does not exist in certain areas of Europe, or at least in certain sections of Europe, that make it you know, stigmatized to the level that these officials don't want to do that. So that's kind of what I would have to say on that front. They're true, and they're sitting right there in the in the public domain.
So I had another question for you. How has the pandemic impacted energy security just in general? Has it affected the construction on Nord Stream, energy consumption patterns, stuff like that?
Well, I mean, the demand has gone way down this year. I mean, we remember at the start of the pandemic when both oil and gas prices were trading excessively low, in the extent that there were times that that U.S. oil prices actually were negative for periods of time, which means like effectively it's, you know, they would in principle pay you to come take gas, you know, take oil off their hands, like if you were running a oil garbage service or something like that. So that happened this year, earlier this year. So it is having an impact. Is it having an impact on Nord Stream's construction? I don't think so. I think the sanctions have. I mean, sanctions are what stopped the project from being built. Right now, the Russians are trying to retrofit the Academic Chersky, a vessel that Gazprom itself owns, that they actually sailed around the world after the sanctions came down and after the pandemic began. It started in Nahotka, the port of Nahotka outside of Vladivostok, and over the course of several months sailed in this really circuitous route around India, and then across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and then eventually all the way up, arriving at the beginning of the summer in the Baltic Sea. I actually wrote a piece for the Jamestown Foundation on this, that I can share after the talk. But it was kind of funny because there were speculation on among experts on social media and in Russian language press that part of the reason they did this was that they were concerned about you know, sanctions on the vessel, or ports not allowing them in, or even that they would be, you know, running afoul of, you know, of sanctions if they went through the Suez Canal, for example. There was all this speculation going on. So they took this extremely long route, never stopping. It was kind of like, if you remember the pretty terrible but pretty classic movie Speed 2 Cruise Control, it's kind of like that in a Gazprom context. And so it was fun to watch. I will say that during the pandemic, I've had a lot of fun passing the time watching these vessels in this context and doing analysis based on that, because to the extent possible, if these vessels are broadcasting their AIS, which is a basically broadcast signal of GPS and radio and things like that from the vessel, then they are publicly mapped on a variety of websites and apps. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this and really nerding out on it, to look at like marinetraffic.com. They have a marine traffic app. You can create your own little fleet and watch where they go. And so that's part of bringing technical analysis into the geopolitical space, to look at, what sort of vessels are gathering at the port. What sort of capabilities do they have based on that, and what can we expect in terms of policy solutions? And again, this has real impact. When you're developing a sanctions package, for example, do you need to do it now, or do you need to do it in 2 years? That can make a big diplomatic difference, and it really depends on the technologies and infrastructure involved. So yeah, again, I think that I can't say enough about trying to take a multidisciplinary approach when it comes to this sort of analysis, and especially national security and foreign policy. That's just essential.
So we have another question from Emerald. What might the completion of Nord Stream 2 mean for energy as a political tool in the future? And how has the project been more insidious than past pipeline projects?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. I've gotten this question a lot. Nord Stream 1 wasn't a big deal. So what's the big deal with Nord Stream 2? Well, Nord Stream 1 was developed, if you go back in the history of this, Nord Stream 1 was first announced way, way, way back in the early 2000s, and it was first considered to be through a deal between Putin and the United Kingdom. So it was supposed to be this this Russian UK project between Putin and Tony Blair, Tony Blair already basically started to see where things were going. I think this was around, if I'm remembering properly, this was around the time of the UCO scandal, so that kind of came into play as well. So UK got out of it, and that's when Germany got into it. Nord Stream 1 was then developed between the mid-2000s and came online between 2011 and 2013. And this was a different time with a different Russia. Certainly there were the beginnings of the current high-pitched of malign activity from the Putin regime. Georgia, the war in Georgia springs to mind. And a number of poisonings and things like this, Litvinenko, for example. That was going on. It was somewhat opposed, but again, it was actually a new route. It was never created, and taking away all the geopolitics, it is somewhat of a modern marvel that it works, because it is the longest subsea pipeline in the world. There is nothing longer than Nord Stream 1. So, and it is in operation, 2 dual 27.5 BCMA pipes. So basically that's the difference. It was a different Russia then. It's certainly a different scenario now, and happening in the wake of Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This would be another arrow in Putin's economic, broader hybrid quiver, this one being an economic and potentially a security one, to further destabilize Ukraine. And that really changed the game massively than what we see now. So if Nord Stream 2 is completed, it's going to have this negative impact. And it's only a matter of time before we see Putin use it in the way that he's used all of the other pipelines that he's developed thus far, Turk Stream being the example from earlier this year.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. So I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, and so I just want to thank, first of all, Ben for coming in and speaking to us today and having this great conversation where we learned a whole lot about energy security in the region. And thank you, everyone, for participating, for the great questions and the great conversation we had today. And I hope you join us for more of the Melikian Center's programming. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.